There are stories the world tries to forget, stories whispered behind closed shutters, buried beneath the silence of law and the weight of shame. Yet some truths refuse to die. They rise like ghosts from the soil of history, demanding to be seen. In the year 1842, in the humid air of Mobile, Alabama, a widow stood before her society and chose love over law, humanity over fear. She reached across the forbidden line that divided human from human, and in that single act, she exposed the fragile walls upon which her world was built. In 1842, the port city of Mobile, Alabama, stood as one of the South's most vivid embodiments of a society both thriving on economic expansion and rotting from moral contradiction. The cotton trade was the lifeblood of the region, and with it came the iron grip of slavery that supported its every artery. Mobile, nestled on the Gulf Coast, was a hub of mercantile ambition where ships carried cotton to distant markets while human lives were traded in local squares. The city's wealth was mirrored by its hierarchy, an intricate web of class, color, and gender distinctions that defined the limits of belonging and power. Every interaction was shaped by an invisible but omnipresent architecture of race, where the body of the enslaved person was not merely property, but a symbol of submission necessary to sustain the illusions of white superiority. In this environment, social law was not simply written on paper, but engraved in the consciousness of its citizens. The codes of race and morality were intertwined with religious justification, often delivered from pulpits and parlor rooms alike. Marriage, as an institution, was considered sacred only within the bounds of whiteness, and its purity was guarded by statutes and by violence. The idea of a white woman forming any intimate connection with a black man, enslaved or free, was beyond the limits of comprehension for most of Mobile's white populace. Such an act did not merely offend moral sensibility, it disrupted the very hierarchy upon which the society was built. To marry across the racial line was to erase the distinction that gave meaning to the oppressor's identity. Yet, beneath this rigid social order, Mobile was also a city of contradictions, of whispered desires and hidden transgressions. The economy depended upon the proximity of enslaved and enslaver, their daily lives interwove in kitchens, fields, and private chambers. Intimacy existed beneath the veneer of power, often born from violence but sometimes from complex emotions that defied the simple language of ownership. In 1842, the widow's marriage to her late husband's slave would have emerged from this turbulent social fabric, a gesture that both shattered and revealed the secret interdependence between master and servant, between freedom and bondage. The laws of Alabama were unambiguous. Statutes prohibited interracial marriage, and those who transgressed faced public degradation, legal punishment, and often mob violence. The enslaved person in such a union could be sold away or executed, while the white partner risked exile or imprisonment. But beyond legal consequence, there was the punishment of social death, the erasure from respectable society, the loss of name and kin. Mobile's elite thrived on appearances, and any breach of racial boundaries threatened the illusion of order that justified their power. 1842, then, was not simply a year in time, but a psychological landscape defined by fear and repression. It was an era when the collective mind of the South was gripped by an unspoken terror, the collapse of the myth of racial purity. In the shadows of its stately mansions and moss-draped oaks, the city bore witness to countless acts of cruelty and contradiction. Within this world, the widow's decision to love and to marry an enslaved man was not only an act of rebellion, but a declaration against the very foundation of her society. It forced Mobile to confront what it most feared: that love, when freed from law, could expose the moral poverty of the world that sought to control it. The story of the widow and the enslaved man begins not merely with defiance, but with an encounter between two human beings caught in the contradictions of their time. She was a woman newly unanchored by death, a figure who had once belonged securely to the ranks of Southern respectability. Widowhood in the antebellum world of mobile was a peculiar space, a fragile intersection between reverence and suspicion. A widow was both honored for her grief and feared for her independence. Without a husband to guide or control her, she lingered in a liminal position, free in name, yet bound by custom and expectation. Her mourning garments marked her as belonging to the past, but her very survival demanded she re-enter the living world. To do so was to risk judgment, for in a society obsessed with appearances, a woman's conduct reflected not her own desires, but the moral health of her entire class. Into this psychological void stepped the enslaved man who had once belonged to her husband. His existence before her husband's death had been defined by servitude, his labor, his body, his very name owned and spoken by another. The death of the master did not bring him liberty. The law ensured that even in death, ownership could be transferred like an object of inheritance. Yet the proximity between the widow and the enslaved man after that death created a space where the boundaries between command and compassion began to blur. He was the one who managed her household, who brought stability to her days of mourning, who stood silent in rooms thick with grief. It is easy to imagine how, over time, their shared isolation might have become a bridge. How unspoken gestures could evolve into understanding. How service might turn into companionship. The nature of their relationship would have been incomprehensible to most of their contemporaries. The widow's love for a man society deemed her inferior would not only be seen as immoral, but as evidence of madness. Yet her act of marriage suggests a deliberate assertion of will, a refusal to accept the role prescribed to her. She crossed a boundary that even men in their assumed power dared not transgress. For her, marriage was not merely a union of affection, but a declaration of humanity, an insistence that love could not be dictated by color or class. For him, the enslaved man, the act of marriage was perhaps the first true recognition of his personhood, a moment where he was seen not as property, but as a man capable of being loved, chosen, and honored. Theirs was not a union of convenience, nor one of reckless passion alone, but of profound spiritual rebellion. In their shared defiance, they reached toward something sacred, even if the world around them declared it profane. The widow's neighbors would have seen sin, the law would have seen crime, the clergy would have seen heresy. Yet behind these condemnations was fear, the fear that the old order might crack if one woman dared to treat a slave as an equal. In that act, she threatened the psychological foundation of the South, the belief that white and black existed in separate realms ordained by nature and God. By choosing to marry him, she did not only violate law, she unmasked its hypocrisy. She revealed that love, stripped of domination, was the most radical force of all. It is important to understand that their story did not unfold in private alone. Every look, every whisper, every footstep outside her home was a potential betrayal. Their love demanded secrecy, yet marriage was an act that demanded witness. To speak vows in a world that forbade them was to risk annihilation. Theirs was an impossible dream made flesh, a union not sanctioned by the church, not protected by the law, but bound by something deeper than either. Whether it ended in exile, imprisonment, or death, their marriage remains a gesture carved against time's cruelty, a fleeting assertion that within the chains of the 19th century South, two souls found in each other a mirror of what it meant to be free. The legal and social repercussions that surrounded the widow's union with her late husband's enslaved man in 1842 were not merely expressions of public outrage. They were the tangible manifestations of a society built upon fear, fear of disorder, fear of equality, and fear of human emotion ungoverned by racial law. In Alabama, as in the rest of the antebellum South, the law functioned as the guardian of a fragile illusion. The illusion that white purity was unassailable, that the slave system was divinely ordained, and that the distinctions between black and white were immutable truths rather than human inventions. The statutes of the time were precise in their cruelty. Interracial marriage, or what they termed miscegenation, was outlawed under severe penalty. For a white woman to engage in such a union was to invite the wrath of both the courts and the community. Legal consequences ranged from imprisonment to the confiscation of property, but the social consequences were far more devastating. The woman would be ostracized, stripped of her social identity, and cast into a kind of living death among her peers. In the eyes of the law, the enslaved man bore no capacity to consent or to claim his own marital rights. He was still, legally, a piece of property. Thus, his participation in such a union was deemed not only criminal, but absurd, a mockery of the legal system that defined him as less than human. If discovered, he could be tortured, sold, or executed under the pretext of rebellion. The white authorities interpreted such acts of intimacy as evidence of insurrectionary spirit, an echo of the uprisings that haunted Southern memory, from Nat Turner's rebellion to the whispered rumors of revenge harbored in every plantation quarter. To marry a slave was, therefore, not only a moral transgression, but a political provocation, a direct affront to the invisible machinery that kept the South's social order intact. For the widow, the punishment extended beyond law. Her very existence became a public spectacle. The gossip that rippled through Mobile's parlors and marketplaces would have been relentless, each retelling sharpening her infamy. Women of her class would turn their backs to her in church. Men would speak of her as diseased, her body and soul corrupted by contact with a man they believed beneath her. Yet, within this ostracism was also the faint pulse of fascination, the scandal that allowed others to reaffirm their own sense of virtue by condemning hers. The social world of Mobile thrived on such narratives, where morality was performed in public while hidden sins festered in private. Her punishment was not only intended to destroy her, but to serve as a warning to others who might dare imagine freedom outside the boundaries of race and propriety. The legal institutions, too, used her case as a reaffirmation of their power. Judges and clerks, themselves bound by the same psychological chains of prejudice, would invoke religious language to justify their rulings. They would call upon Scripture to defend the natural order and claim divine authority for their cruelty. Yet beneath this pious rhetoric was anxiety, the sense that the very laws they enforced were brittle, that one act of love could expose their entire system as an edifice of lies. For every punishment they inflicted, they sought to erase the evidence of possibility. If love could cross the color line, then what became of their hierarchy? If a slave could be a husband, what became of the master's godhood? The enslaved man's fate, though lost to history, would have been determined by the whims of those who feared him most. His body, once property, became a symbol of defiance, and symbols were dangerous. He might have been whipped publicly, paraded as a warning, or disappeared entirely, sold into a harsher world far from the woman he had dared to love. The widow's punishment was social death, his physical annihilation. In this cruel symmetry, the South revealed its truest face, a civilization terrified not of violence but of tenderness. Every law it passed, every punishment it dealt, was an act of suppression against the very humanity it sought to deny. The repercussions of their union thus echoed far beyond their own lives. They exposed the fragility of a world built upon domination and the lengths to which that world would go to preserve itself. Their love, forbidden and punished, became an unintentional mirror held up to a society that had outlawed the simplest and most dangerous truth, that all souls, regardless of color, hunger for the same freedom. Beyond the scandal and outrage that surrounded the widow's marriage to her late husband's enslaved man lies a deeper realm, the psychological and emotional landscape that framed their act. It is here, in the silent interplay between desire, guilt, and the yearning for liberation, that the story takes on a profound human depth. Every transgression against social law begins first as a conflict within the self, and in this case, the union was not only a rebellion against society, but also a confrontation with the hidden corners of the psyche. The widow, long accustomed to the constraints of propriety, lived in a world where her emotions were prescribed by role: daughter, wife, and then widow. Her worth was measured by obedience and her virtue by restraint. When her husband died, the architecture that gave her identity collapsed, and she was left to face the void of her own existence. In that emptiness, suppressed desires and questions, those long buried beneath duty, began to rise. The man who had once been her husband's slave became the mirror in which she saw her own captivity. His bondage, visible and brutal, reflected the subtler imprisonment of her own spirit. The emotional bond that grew between them cannot be reduced to scandal or sentimentality. It must be understood as an awakening, a recognition of the shared pain that transcended race and class. In the enslaved man, she encountered a being who understood silence, who lived daily in fear and yet preserved an inner dignity that defied his condition. In her, he found someone who for the first time saw him not as property, but as presence. The two, bound by grief and isolation, began to move toward one another through gestures, glances, and the quiet exchange of care. It is in these unspoken spaces that human connection deepens, often in defiance of reason. Their intimacy was not merely physical, but spiritual, a mutual descent into forbidden emotion that neither could have named without consequence. The very intensity of their love was heightened by the knowledge that it could not exist in the daylight of their world. Psychologically, their union also revealed the contradictions embedded in the Southern consciousness. The white mistress who dared to love a slave was confronting the shadow of her own culture, the repressed acknowledgement of humanity in those it enslaved. To feel affection for the enslaved man was to feel guilt. To deny it was to live in hypocrisy. Every emotion she experienced was burdened by the weight of centuries of indoctrination, and to act upon it meant dismantling the moral edifice within herself. For the man, the act carried its own torment. Love, for him, was dangerous because it demanded the assertion of a self that the law denied him. Every expression of tenderness risked punishment. Yet to love her was also to reclaim something sacred, to declare that his soul could not be confined to chains. Emotionally, their relationship embodied both ecstasy and terror. Each moment of intimacy was a crossing into forbidden territory, each whisper a risk. They lived under the gaze of a society that could not comprehend their bond except through the language of sin and crime. Yet it was precisely this pressure that made their connection so psychologically potent. Love under persecution transforms into revelation. It exposes the layers of deceit upon which the social order rests. The widow's feelings, once constrained by the expectations of womanhood, now expanded into defiance. His devotion, once limited to servitude, became a form of resistance. Their emotional union was thus not only personal, but political in its unconscious intent. It was the psyche's revolt against the chains imposed by law, religion, and race. At its core, their relationship revealed the human need to reconcile the divided self. She sought redemption from the guilt of privilege. He sought the restoration of dignity through love. Together, they momentarily bridged the distance between oppressor and oppressed, not through ideology, but through raw emotion. Yet this reconciliation could not last. The external world, with its laws and punishments, would soon reassert itself. Still, in that brief interlude, they achieved a kind of psychological freedom that society could never grant. It was the freedom of seeing and being seen, of touching without hierarchy, of feeling without permission. In that forbidden act, they uncovered a truth older than any nation or law, that the human heart, even when burdened by history's cruelties, will always reach toward connection, even if it must do so in the shadows. The union between the widow and her late husband's enslaved man in 1842 carried a meaning that extended beyond their personal defiance. It was a symbolic act that reached into the very soul of their society. The marriage represented not just the meeting of two individuals, but the collision of two worlds, two halves of a divided humanity forced into false opposition by law, race, and history. In a culture built upon separation, white and black, free and enslaved, pure and impure, their coming together was an event that defied the myth of difference upon which that world depended. To the eyes of their contemporaries, it was an act of contamination, but to the deeper consciousness of history, it was a moment of reconciliation. The widow and the enslaved man stood as living contradictions, embodying the possibility that love might bridge what power had torn apart. Symbolically, their union can be seen as a merging of the oppressor and the oppressed, the conscience and the shadow. In every system of domination, there exists a hidden truth, that the master's authority depends upon the humanity of the one he enslaves. Without that humanity, domination has no meaning. The widow, by choosing her husband's slave, inverted that relationship. She turned toward the very figure her society taught her to despise, not in pity, but in recognition. In him, she found what her own world lacked: authenticity, endurance, and the raw vitality of existence unmasked by pretense. In her, he found the possibility of being acknowledged as a man rather than an object. Their union thus became an unconscious ritual of healing, where the boundaries of identity dissolved in the shared experience of forbidden love. It was, in a sense, a sacrament against the church of oppression. At a psychological level, the act of marriage between them carried the weight of transformation. It revealed what happens when the individual confronts the illusions of social order and chooses the truth of emotion over the comfort of conformity. The widow's act symbolized the feminine principle of descent, of turning inward, facing darkness, and emerging renewed. In embracing the man her world called inferior, she faced the parts of herself that her society had taught her to suppress: compassion, instinct, and moral courage. For the enslaved man, the marriage was equally symbolic, for it declared that he was more than what his chains proclaimed. It was an affirmation of personhood through love, a claim to equality that no legal document could bestow. In that union, even if only for a moment, he became not a servant but a partner, a husband, a man recognized in his wholeness. The symbolism of their union also reflects a deeper cultural anxiety. The antebellum South was a world obsessed with purity, the purity of blood, lineage, and gender roles. To marry across the color line was to expose the falsehood of that purity, to reveal that the lines dividing human beings were inventions, not truths. Their marriage was a mirror held up to the collective psyche of the South, showing it what it feared most: that the hierarchy it enforced so violently was nothing more than an elaborate disguise for its own insecurity. The very laws that forbade such unions existed precisely because the possibility of them was always present. The plantation household was not a fortress of purity, but a space of constant, unspoken mingling of bodies, bloodlines, and emotions that crossed boundaries despite all efforts to prevent them. The widow's act tore the mask away. Even in the eyes of history, the symbolic resonance of their marriage endures. It reminds us that human love, when it appears in its raw and ungoverned form, is the great leveler of all constructed hierarchies. The widow's defiance, whether seen as madness or revelation, became a testament to the power of feeling over fear. Their bond was not a fantasy of equality, but a momentary embodiment of it, fragile and doomed, but real. In joining herself to him, she entered into a union not merely with a man, but with the truth of humanity itself, a truth buried beneath centuries of prejudice and control. The symbols of their act are therefore not confined to the past. They speak to every age that seeks to separate the human spirit into categories of worth. Their marriage stands as a brief illumination in a dark landscape, a reminder that even under the weight of law and hatred, the heart continues to reach for its other half, and that in that reaching, the world's deepest wounds are momentarily healed. The legacy of the widow who married her late husband's enslaved man in 1842 lingers as a haunting echo across time, not because the event itself was recorded in great detail, but because of what it revealed about the eternal struggle between love and law, spirit and structure, freedom and fear. Her story, nearly erased by the society that condemned her, survives as an archetype of rebellion against the collective mind that rules through prejudice. Every forbidden act of love leaves behind a residue, an imprint upon the moral imagination of future generations. Even when silenced, it continues to speak through the discomfort it creates. The world of 1842 sought to bury such unions under the weight of shame and censorship, yet these very acts of suppression only serve to magnify their symbolic power. In that defiance, one finds not simply a personal narrative, but a universal pattern, the confrontation between human authenticity and the systems that seek to contain it. The legacy of this union is twofold. It belongs both to the historical record of injustice and to the inner history of human courage. On the surface, the consequences were grim. The law punished, the church exiled, the town gossiped, and the bodies involved bore the price of transgression. Yet beneath that suffering lay a different kind of inheritance, the awakening of empathy and the slow erosion of certainty. Every time a boundary is crossed, no matter how violently suppressed, it loosens the grip of dogma on the human conscience. The widow's marriage, impossible in its time, forced her community to confront what it most wished to ignore: that the human heart does not obey the codes of race or status. It exposed the absurdity of a civilization that claimed moral superiority while denying humanity to most of its people. Even those who condemned her could not unsee the image of a white woman pledging herself to a man the law called property. That vision, scandalous though it was, carved a wound in the collective consciousness, a wound that would, over time, become an opening. The legacy of her act extends into the psychological domain as well. The story endures because it captures a truth about the shadow side of civilization. Every society builds itself upon exclusions, upon the repression of what it deems impure or dangerous. The South of the 19th century constructed its identity on the myth of racial superiority, but that myth was never secure. The forbidden marriage became a manifestation of what that culture had repressed: the undeniable human connection between master and slave, between white and black, between power and vulnerability. The widow and her chosen husband embodied that repressed truth. Their love was an eruption of the very thing society denied existed: equality born of shared humanity. The psychological power of this story lies in its ability to unsettle. It reminds us that the structures we build to control desire, emotion, and identity are never absolute. They fracture in the presence of genuine feeling. In a broader historical sense, their story foreshadows the slow, painful journey toward emancipation and civil rights. Each act of forbidden love, each whispered defiance contributed to the eventual unraveling of the system that sought to suppress it. Though the widow and her husband may not have lived to see freedom, their transgression became part of the moral undercurrent that challenged the old order. It demonstrated that resistance does not always take the form of open revolt. Sometimes it manifests as tenderness in the face of tyranny. Theirs was a rebellion of intimacy, a quiet revolution against a world that measured worth by color. In this way, their legacy becomes universal. It speaks to every generation that has lived under systems of exclusion, reminding us that love is not only a private sentiment, but also a political act when directed against injustice. Today, the story survives less as a historical footnote and more as a mirror. It reflects the enduring conflict between what society demands and what the soul desires. The widow's marriage continues to provoke because it asks the same question that confronts humanity in every age. What is the cost of obedience to an unjust order? Her legacy is not the scandal her contemporaries saw, but the courage to act from the heart when the heart's truth defies the world. The Forbidden Union of 1842 stands as a whisper from the past, reminding us that the boundaries humans build of race, class, gender, and faith are fragile illusions when measured against the timeless need to love and to be seen. In the end, her story is less about transgression than about transcendence, less about sin than about the painful birth of moral awakening. What remains is not her punishment or the world's condemnation, but the quiet endurance of love itself, still echoing beyond the ruins of the laws that once sought to destroy it.